I recently had my 2013 Audi S4 up in the air to diagnose a rattling exhaust on startup. Turned out to be the recently replaced midsection couplers that I replaced because the old ones had rusted through and my exhaust fell out on track during the track day at Donington Park I did last year. Good times. Fixed that, put some exhaust paste, tightened it up properly. It's all good, but while I was there and checking the front flex pipes, I had a look at the side, or each side of the engine block, and noticed basically a bit of an oil leak. It was sort of a dampness. There wasn't all that much there, although I did notice a small sort of trail of oil on the undercarriage of the car and towards the, sliding towards the back of the gearbox and doing that annoying like dirt collection type thing that leaked oil does. That's great, but I noticed that and had a bit of an inspection and realised that it was my valve cover gaskets. They're a relatively common thing to go bad over time on the 3-litre TFSI engine I have, so let's get to replacing them. Now, I'm happy to report that there doesn't look to be all that much oil that's actually come out of them, and I keep a fairly regular eye on my engine oil level anyway. And there really wasn't much missing, so I'm happy to report that I think I caught it relatively early. I'm also happy to report that doing this job requires very little in the way of tools. Pretty much just some common hand tools, as you might say, although there is one tool in particular that I would highly recommend you pick up before attempting this if you don't already have one, and that is a bit driver ratchet, or a 1/4 inch ratcheting spanner, basically. That is a way to use your little, Torx or hex bits, but as the actual sort of tool itself, rather than needing to put them in their housing and then put a connector on the back of that to then be able to turn it, you can just use the bit itself and be able to ratchet them open or closed. And specifically for the Torx, the T30 bolts towards the back of both of your valve covers, there really isn't much space between the engine and valve cover and the shock tower. So having one of those is going to make removing and installing, especially those rear bolts, significantly easier. Other than that, you'll only really need a few other tools. Things like a T20 and T30 bit and bit driver, 7 and 10mm sockets, some pry bars, a set of picks will probably be helpful, some rags, and ideally you will have a way to remove and sort of drain all of the coolant out of your coolant overflow tank so that you can move that out of the way. Although in my case, I did end up managing to do this whole job without removing that, but I actually would genuinely recommend removing it, and therefore removing all of the coolant from it first before attempting this. It will make it much easier. You'll also need the replacement gaskets. I'll stick both the Audi or VAG part code or part numbers on screen, along with the Febi Bilstein part number for the one that I actually ended up getting. That is these two. You can work out which one is left and right once you actually install them on the car, because I can't remember. But those are the parts, and that's pretty much all the tools you'll need as well. As for the process of actually replacing the gaskets, I'm also happy to report that it's relatively simple. All you're really doing is just removing the relatively few things that are in the way for you to take the gaskets off, unbolting the covers themselves, and then replacing them. There are a couple of things that you should know though. Specifically, the biggest and most sort of almost risky factor here is the 2 PCV hoses, or positive crankcase ventilation system hoses, towards the rear upper side of both of the valve covers. These hoses, in particular the connectors that hold them onto the valve cover, get brittle very easily and sort of relatively quickly, and once they are brittle, they're very easy to break. And if you do break them, well, unfortunately, those hoses go all the way down under the supercharger to the PCV system itself. There's no easy way to replace them. You just have to take the supercharger off, and that takes this from a relatively simple, relatively straightforward job to one that's relatively costly and a massive pain. To get them off, if you have the style of clip that I have, which is the sort of two-pronged or two-clipped connector with two sides that are designed for you to press on them to sort of squeeze the oval outwards, then what you can do is obviously be very gentle and careful, but gently both press on the connector, and you can use a pick to, again, very gently prise the clips up and over the sort of spout on the valve cover itself. If, however, you have what I've seen as the other type of connector, where it has 4 clips built in a sort of almost clover leaf type pattern, then, well, good luck to you. I've heard that those are incredibly difficult and annoying, and like I said, just be very gentle, use a pick, be careful, and you should be able to get it off. For the driver's side, at least here in the UK, you'll need to remove the intake piping and air box, both for the whole job and just to even get that hose or that connector off. You want to start by using a 7mm socket to loosen up the hose clamps, and then try working the pipe off. You might need to start moving the air box around first, which will require you to pop the front sort of fascia trim piece up, and then use the 7mm socket to remove the 2 bolts that hold the sort of front ram air intake type mount to then remove the front piping, as it were. And you'll also need to unclip any hoses that are connected to your intake piping or air box, and also make sure to very carefully remove the, I think like sort of vacuum hose type thing on the rear side of the intake hose up by the throttle body. Make sure to support that connector, or that sort of connector, as you're, working it off gently. To remove the airbox itself, once you have the main intake piping off, you can basically just lift it up. Do be careful though, as there is a hose on the bottom side of the airbox with the same sort of push to disconnect connector, so be careful, and you can try pushing upwards on the pipe itself, then squeezing, then pulling the pipe down, and that should get it off for you, and then the airbox can be moved out of the way. If you manage to get the 2 PCV hoses off without breaking them, then first of all, congratulations, and second of all, your next step is to remove the 2 T20 screws per side that hold the plug or coil wiring in place. The driver's side here in the UK is easy enough. The passenger side one though, you might need to move the coolant overflow tank if you haven't removed it already. I do genuinely recommend sort of pulling all of the coolant out of there and just removing it. It will make the entire process a lot easier. But if you are stubborn like me and kind of refuse to do that, then you'll need to remove the 2 nut and washer sort of combos at the back with they're 10mm. Just unscrew those, move them out of the way, and then you can lift the entire coolant bottle up off of those 2 studs and its lower rubber mount as well, and you should be able to maneuver it well enough to get those 2 T20s out. Your next task is to then remove the connectors from each of the plugs. Because they're a part of that whole red plastic sort of container, what you'll need to do is, normally if you pull the connector sort of inwards as if you're plugging it in, then push the tab on the clip itself down and then pull backwards slightly. That should allow you to get the connector off. Bear in mind that it won't come all the way out, as all 3 are kind of linked together, so you'll need to do one at a time, and then once you have all 3 of them just slightly off, you should then be able to pull the whole thing back and unplug all 3 sort of simultaneously. Of course, repeat that for the other side. Also, if you have trouble doing that, then you might want to use a pick in the end of the connector, the clip itself, again, carefully, so that you can remove them that way. There's also 2 small 10mm bolts that are in the rear timing covers, one on either side, that hold a small metal bracket that is zip tied to the wiring. You could, in theory, just cut the zip tie and replace it if you wanted. I think it's a slightly special type of clip, but So I thought that removing the single bolt per side would be an easier option. Turned out to be quite a pain to get it back in properly, but if you do, you'll need to remove that, or at least move that out of the way, and also use a T30 to remove a small grounding wire, grounding strap on either side for those plugs. To be able to get the plugs or coils out, it can be a bit of a pain as these can get stuck in pretty well. What I would recommend you do is to grab a rag or towel to protect your valve cover, then use a pry bar, something of the like, to lever the plugs out carefully. Make sure you don't just, yank them out and destroy the things. Nice and slow, nice and steady, but once you get them out, you can then, at least in my case, I used what you might call special Hoover attachment, which is just some flexible or plastic tubing and a bit of duct tape to hoover up all of the dirt and debris that was in the spark plug wells. There wasn't much, but it was enough to make me concerned, so gave it a bit of a clean, and for good measure I stuck some paper towels in there. I'm not taking the spark plugs out, but I thought that it was just an extra bit of insurance and it couldn't hurt. Looking at the coils themselves, you can see that they had a hint of oil, at least some of them did, from where the seal on the valve cover started to leak and start to fail. So I'm glad that I got to this stage where it's only a hint of oil and not, a spark plug well absolutely full of it and causing loads of misfires and other problems. Once you have those out, you can then grab your T30 and crack all of the valve cover bolts free. Now, in particular, this can be a bit difficult, especially for those back ones. Like I said, this is where the bit driver ratchet might come in handy. And it's also worth noting that there are a couple of other connectors that you might need to maneuver out of the way. They have little white or grey locking tabs. You lift those up and then you can squeeze the connector down or the clip down and pull the connector out. You want the 2 map sensors by the supercharger. On the, in my case, driver's side, there's a small sensor there, and there's also 2 sensor wires on the sort of back side of the valve covers, or just off of them. It can be handy to have those out of the way as well. Once all of those bolts are loose, I found that because they're captive bolts in the plastic valve cover itself, I had to, first of all, carefully use some pry tools or trim tools to lift the valve cover up and prise it up. Once I had it up though, I found that all of the bolts weren't actually fully out of the cylinder head, so I had to hold the valve cover up and then fully undo them. Once they're all out though, you can then lift the valve cover up and away, and in my case I put some paper towels down to make sure that no debris fell into the engine. Now I happened to do this on a rather strange day where it was beautifully sunny and then it was snowing, and then it was beautifully sunny and then it was snowing, and actually just as I got the valve cover off, it started snowing again. So I gave it a good clean while I was outside and then brought it in to very carefully use a pick to prise the old gasket off. Now, I'm happy to report that my gasket, while fairly hard, fairly stiff, and clearly was slightly leaking, it's not as bad as I've seen. It didn't break apart as I was pulling it out. It did stay all in one piece, so I have definitely got to it in a reasonable state, but it's far from being quite as nice and supple as the new gaskets are. When it comes to installing that new gasket, you'll find that you need to push the bolts up from the sort of top side of the valve cover and then push the seal around their little sort of captive carriers. That's so that the oil won't just seep straight up and out through the bolt holes themselves, and you need to do that as it won't just sit down properly if you don't. So do make sure you get them all nicely seated and pushed through the gasket itself. And then once that is all done and the valve cover is nice and clean, you'll then want to make sure that you give the sort of mating surface a good clean. Make sure there's no contaminants there, it's nice and flush, there's no little bits of old gasket material that have stuck to the block instead. Make sure it's nice and clean. And in my case, I held a second sort of paper towel it's just inside the lip so that any dust or debris or anything that I was, scraping off would fall onto that and not onto the camshafts or into the engine in general. You can then drop the valve cover back down in place and tighten all of the bolts down. The official torque spec here is 9 Newton meters, although I would argue that since both a lot of torque wrenches don't do 9 Newton meters, and that you're kind of unlikely to be able to get a torque wrench on some of the bolts, especially the rear sort of lower side ones, I would argue that consistent, firm but not heavy pressure is probably the more important factor than the specific torque spec. At least that's what I'm telling myself anyway. So, a nice even torque on all, ideally to 9 Newton meters for all of them. And then you can start putting everything back on. Of course, you will need to repeat that process of replacing the valve cover on the other side, which in my case was even just slightly more of a pain, but thanks to the coolant bottle being in the way. But again, once that's done, you can put everything back together, including putting the coils back in place, making sure that they're seated fully down, making sure that you reattach the grounding wire and the small 10mm bolts in the timing cover, obviously putting the not injector, I keep saying injector and then having to restart, putting the coil wiring back into place, making sure those all click nice and firmly, and putting those T20s back in, putting your coolant bottle back, either just putting it back down or putting it back in and refilling it. And I think that's kind of that. Obviously the intake piping as well. I had a bit of a pain getting the airbox back in. That sort of hose on the lower side by the front wing was a bit of a difficulty, but got it in the end. And of course reattached the 2 screws to the front sort of ram air intake type mount and put the trim pieces back on that fascia piece and the clips for that as well. I think this took me something like 5 hours all in to do both sides, and I think it would have been a fair bit faster if I had the bit driver, and if I had a friend around, it'd probably be even quicker as well. So this is definitely something that you can do on a weekend with some relatively minimal tool sets and a bit of time and patience and a bit of effort. It's something that I'm very glad that I have done. And actually, even though I don't have a garage, which if you do have one to do this sort of job in, it's obviously going to be a nice sort of cleaner environment, so would recommend instead. But even still, it's something that I was perfectly capable of doing just on my driveway, and so hopefully this video is helpful for you. If it has been, feel free to let me know in the comments, leave a like. If you want to see more videos like this one from me, or more car reviews or tool reviews, or anything like that, feel free to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. I've got loads of other videos both on this car and plenty of others on the channel, so feel free to check those out on the end cards. And if you want to support me in these videos, then you can check out some of the links in the description, stuff like hoodies or t-shirts like this one. Or there's also some affiliate links to some tools and stuff like that that I use or recommend, so feel free to take a look. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.